In much of the world, women have always straddled a paradoxical line in society. They were shining beacons of purity and beauty, whilst at the same time being seen as second-class citizens, existing as property, owned by the men in their lives. They have suffered untold horrors, and still do in much of the world today. In early modern Europe, between the years of 1560 and 1630, witchcraft lurked around every corner. Whether a child was born blind or a pig fell and died suddenly, there was a good chance it was the work of a local witch, or perhaps even an entire coven, working in league with Satan. Or so some thought. Europe was in a frenzy during this period regarding black magic, more so than it had ever been previously. While men were sometimes accused of witchcraft, in most societies, women were persecuted for this offense, much more than men. Illustrating perfectly the brutality of the old world, some of the worst punishments were not even punishments, but trials to assess the guilt of the accused. Perhaps the most famous of these trials is the ducking stool. Yes, the ducking stool, though associated with witches, was a general form of punishment for women, and was used as a punishment for female scolds, argumentative women who caused a public nuisance. The ducking stool was essentially a playground seesaw or teeter-totter, with one end hanging over a lake or pond. The accused would be bound to the board, dunked underwater, and held down. As a punishment for scolds, it was used to scare and humiliate. In cases of supposed witchcraft, it was used to prove or disprove the woman's supernatural abilities. They would be held underwater for a prolonged period, often long enough to cause death. If the victim floated, it was seen as a sign of the devil, as his possession of the woman caused her body to reject the pure baptismal water. If they drowned, they were not guilty. The ducking stool, originally referred to as a cucking stool, was used as early as the 11th century by the Anglo-Saxons, and last used in the early 19th century, though it had become rare long before that. Its final two victims were Jenny Pipes and Sarah Leek, two notorious scolds from Leominster, England. Hanging was the most common execution method for criminals of, well, all sorts, from murderers to witches. Though witches were sometimes burnt at the stake, the usual sentence for religious heretics. Burning was also used on female counterfeiters and those who murdered their husbands. Usually they were tied to an upright stake and a fire was lit at their feet, though sometimes they were also placed inside a barrel of pitch, a flammable, tar-like substance. The execution was incredibly slow and painful, as the fire below them slowly cooked them to death. The pain was worst early on, as eventually the victim's nerves were destroyed. The fire dehydrates the victim's organs and muscles, causing them to shrink and contract, with the skin around the neck sometimes shrinking so much it suffocates the victim. In Britain, burning as a sentence for murder was abolished, but it was still used as a punishment for women guilty of adultery. In the later years, female victims were often strangled before the fire killed them, as a form of mercy. A witness describes the ordeal in the last instance of the burning of a woman in 1726, saying, "The executioner was foiled in an endeavor to strangle her by the burning of the rope, and the woman was finally killed by a piece of wood which was thrown at her head and dashed out her brains." Pricking was another form of witch identification, which included piercing the flesh of the woman's body with a sharp needle in multiple places. Innocent women bled, as all humans do, while those in league with the devil did not bleed, nor did they receive any wound. Pricking was, however, usually little more than an illusion. Professional witch finders, who were paid per witch brought to trial, used special needles with blunt tips, hollow handles, and retractable blades. No wound was made, as the blunt steel rod collapsed into the handle. Witch finders were respectable as loyal servants of God, and so very few would ever question their honesty. Good pay only encouraged unscrupulous witch finders, for whom it was very easy to prove the guilt of any woman they so wished. Self-proclaimed witch finder general Matthew Hopkins, who was responsible for trying more witches between 1944 and 1947 than had been tried the entire 160 years prior, was paid £23 for his services at Stowe Market. almost 5,000 pounds today. Public humiliation. Generally, punishments for females were often used as a form of public humiliation, and rather than being used for offenses such as theft or violence, they were used to suppress what was considered antisocial behavior, such as gossiping, arguing with your husband, or generally unladylike behaviors such as being drunk. The scold's bridle was used for this purpose, to prevent the victim from carrying on with their antisocial behavior and to display to the community the crime they had committed. The scold's bridle, also known as the branks, was an iron cage and muzzle that was strapped to the victim's head to prevent her from talking, used in England and Scotland. Sometimes they included a metal projection that sat inside the mouth, sometimes sharp, so any movement of the tongue or mouth would result in injury. And some had iron masks designed to look like grotesque creatures. The first ever mention of its use comes from Scotland in 1567, during the reign of James VI of Scotland. The women were usually paraded through the town, though sometimes the bridle was attached to a local monument, keeping the victim confined there for the duration of her punishment. The shrew's fiddle, shrew meaning much the same thing as scold, was a similar punishment used in Germany and Austria. Named after its vague resemblance to a violin, it was a small wooden portable stockade. The head would be locked in one hole. The arms were trapped in two smaller holes. Much like the bridle, the intention was to humiliate and not necessarily harm, and the victim was often paraded around throughout the town or village. There also existed the double fiddle, used to punish two arguing women. It was essentially two fiddles joined together. The arguing pair would be locked inside and forced to be confined together for some time. A more recent form of female humiliation was the charivari, practiced in Europe and North America. Charivari was not a legal sentence for a criminal offense, but a form of social punishment, used against those who had committed what were seen as cultural offenses as opposed to criminal ones. It was often used on women who had remarried too early after being widowed, unwed mothers, and women who were bossy with their husbands. The punishment took two forms, one using an effigy of the victim, and one using the actual victim. The victim or effigy was carried throughout town on a platform, while the crowd made noise, banged pots and pans, and sang songs about the offender. The practice still occurred during the turn of the 20th century, though very rarely. Mutilation and execution. Bodily mutilation was a somewhat common form of punishment, to leave a permanent record of the crime on the victim's body so that they could never escape the shame of their offense. The removal of the nose is one method that has existed for almost 4,000 years, first being mentioned in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, and was still occurring in some areas in the early 20th century. In 1120, in the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem, nose removal was made the punishment for female adultery, and also used on Christian women who had slept with Muslim men. It was used in medieval Europe, used by King Frederick the Great to punish unfaithful wives. Self-mutilation was also used as a form of defense. During the height of Viking raids in the 9th century, there are multiple accounts of nuns severing their noses to avoid sexual violence. Also mentioned in the Code of Hammurabi is the removal of a woman's breasts, which also occurred in medieval Europe. In Europe, this was done by way of the iron spider, or breast ripper. Compared to many medieval torture devices, it was rather crude, simply being a set of iron tongs with 4 spikes, protruding horizontally from the end. The device was usually heated over coals and then clamped over the breast, which was then torn off. Other forms of female mutilation were also used, such as ear removal, which was prescribed by King Canute for the crime of adultery and applied only to the wife. The earlier laws of King Alfred prescribed a milder form of mutilation, with the offender having her hair cut off. In early Frankish law, the woman was to be murdered. The murder of the male lover was optional and at the husband's bequest. Stoning was an Islamic method of execution exclusively for women guilty of adultery, though it has never been a common practice. The woman was buried waist deep in the ground, and a baying mob threw stones at her until she died. Though a relic in the vast majority of the Islamic world, it still does occur, rarely, usually in areas controlled by extremist groups. In the early Roman Emperor Augustus wished to improve the morals of Roman society and so introduced new laws regarding adultery. In its mildest form, the two guilty parties were banished to different regions. But the punishment could be more severe, as the father of the adulterous woman was permitted to murder her. Similar laws existed in the Byzantine Empire, where the guilty woman was put to death. Forced marriage. While most of these brutal practices are now extinct, relics of a more uncivilized age, some torturous practices still exist at some level to this day. Throughout history and in many cultures, female virginity has been seen as a necessary virtue, and without it, women were seen to be spoiled, impure, and unsuitable for marriage. Because of this belief, women who were the victims of violence were forced to wed their attackers. The Middle Assyrian laws are the first mention of a marry your abuser law, a term coined in 2010. The law states that if an unmarried man violates an unmarried woman, the father may marry off his daughter to the attacker for a price. A similar law was established by the Shulchan Aruch, a medieval Jewish law book in which the attacker may marry the girl and pay her father 50 coins of silver. In these cases, the woman or girl was considered the property of her father, and so the fine paid to the father was compensation for damage to his property. Laws like this were common in much of the world until the 1970s in places such as the Middle East and North Africa. Similarly, as recent as 1997, 15 Latin American countries allowed an abuser to be cleared of all charges if he offered to marry his victim. Even in Europe, some places still practiced this custom. In Sicily in 1965, Franca Viola, a girl of 17 years old, was taken into the night, abducted by 13 men and held captive in the home of Filippo Melodia, who then violated her. She was held hostage for 8 days. Her father involved the police and she was eventually freed. Melodia offered to marry her, but she refused. Because of this, the traditional Sicilian customs, she was then a donna svergognata, a woman without honor. Melodia was sentenced to 11 years in prison, but the law allowing abusers to evade justice by marrying their victim was not abolished until 1981, and abuse, which had previously been a crime against public morality, was not made a crime against the person until 1996. The practice still continues in parts of the world in Ethiopia, Somaliland, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Despite no laws allowing the practice or even laws specifically condemning it, it remains a cultural tradition in places where a woman is valued more for her purity, her virginity, than anything else, and where they are seen as familial possession and not persons in their own right.